is kind, inclusionary, and not afraid to go against the status quo. After completing an undergraduate in urban planning, he's gotten involved in activism and environmentalism and works for a number of organizations across the city. Gabe's work is to improve people's lives in the city. As a fellow urbanist, Gabe and I share a passion for urban space, cycling, and sustainability. He recently started a project on people's interactions with urban spaces and the city during the pandemic, which has helped inspire me to do this podcast. Gabe seems to pursue projects he's passionate about and makes other people care too. He's very social and loved by all. He's also lighthearted and fun, never afraid to make a joke or play some unconventional music. So please help me welcome Gabe to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
What was your mindset and decision process like after finishing university? So how did you decide what to pursue next? And was there ever any pressure to follow a certain trajectory?
Throughout my undergraduate degree, I quickly realized that I was not going to take this urban studies degree and then go become an urban planner. The degree I did, the program at Concordia that I followed is very community development focused. And I did an internship while I was at school at the Pratt Center for Community Development, which is a nonprofit linked to the Pratt University in Brooklyn, New York. And they're entirely focused on community development. And it's a nonprofit. So it's kind of that kind of nonprofit planning outlook. And I felt quite at home there. So it quickly became clear to me that I was probably going to end up doing something community oriented, probably in a nonprofit, probably low paid, but high personal reward. I don't really know what the other kids in my program were aiming to do with their degree actually afterward. One guy I knew went directly into a real estate firm, I think. Some people got jobs with cities. And for myself, I kind of finished my degree with this desire to just float a little bit. I wasn't in any rush to find a job that I could directly fall into right after finishing school. I wasn't super ambitious on the job search front. I figured I'll give myself a little break after graduating, kind of float, see what's out there. And I just had a bunch of opportunities kind of fall into my lap. And so I got to try out a bunch of very different things on a very small time scale. I had a friend who was high up in an urban planning firm. So he actually brought me on to do a project for them. I had done a project for them just as a person on the field, kind of low paid, grunt work before, during school. And in school, I had taken 2 GIS courses, which is Geographic Information Systems, which is kind of a very specialized urban planning and geography tool on the computer. And so I kind of had some skills in that I could put to use. So my friend in this planning firm hired me as just an kind of a consultant to help them do this GIS project. That lasted for a month, and that was super cool, very technical. I got to see what the kind of work that an urban planning firm kind of does. It was a small urban planning firm. It was working on industrial sites in the city of Laval. So we were, the project was about determining which sites out of 100 sites or something were the most appropriate for industrial uses, because the Laval was trying to work on its economic development plan and industrial development plan. So that lasted for a month only, super fun. Working in the Mile End, it was very cool. It was the middle of summer. I was fresh out of school. I was falling in love too. Very happy-go-lucky time. And that ended. In the meantime, I had gotten interested in this organization called Entremise. And what they do is they work on a framework for transitory use, as they call it, which is finding vacant buildings and vacant properties and seeing what kind of uses can be hosted in these spaces in the meantime before those buildings get turned into something else or get put back into use. So I found that their mission was really interesting. They were just starting out themselves. And I was okay, cool. I'm out of school. I have no job. I'm just going to approach these guys and see what can happen. And it was very audacious. It it was a funny thing to do. I just I had met them once or twice, like at I don't know, whatever kind of Concordia oriented event, urban planning event. And I emailed them and I was like, hey, I want to work for you. Give me a job. And if you don't have a job, then I'll do some volunteer work for you. And they were very caught off guard. I think they kind of enjoyed my enthusiasm. So they were like, okay, fine. Let's meet for a coffee. We got a coffee and they were like, yeah, look, we absolutely can't hire someone out of the blue right now, which makes a lot more sense now that I understand how human resources work. But they were like, we do have this one project that, we could use a hand with. It's just kind of a thing we need to do over the next 2 months. And you could just do it a couple hours here, a couple hours there, whatever you want. The project was actually making an inventory, a database of vacant spaces in Montreal based off city records that they had. So that was super interesting, very grunt worky. I did it as a volunteer. And it was just fun to get to know those guys. And they reappeared later on in my professional career, actually. So those were some pretty cool professional contacts to make at that point. Third thing that happened was I knew someone through my dad who ran a green roof in Brooklyn. And she was looking for an event coordinator to help her prepare a 1-day-long festival on the green roof in Brooklyn. And she had a little stipend of $1,000 US to hire someone to do that. And so I went down to New York and helped her do that. So these three things kind of all happened between when I graduated, which was in May, and September of 2017. That was just a great time. That was just such a great time. Very low stakes, very high energy, high enthusiasm. It was so cool. And now it's actually, you're interviewing me at an interesting time because I'm actually at a similar crossroads as I was at that time. Because you might be disappointed because you're interviewing me about my work and the work that I do, but I just quit my job last week. So now, and I've adopted the same mindset that I had in 2017, graduating from school. I feel like I just graduated from a 2.5-year long pursuit of my career path. And now I just kind of want to float and see what's out there. And it seems like I'm starting the cycle over again.
Considering now a lot of people are more aware of issues and pushing for large-scale systemic changes across the globe with things like race, justice, climate change, I wanted to know from you, since you've been involved with a lot of different organizations, what have you learned from working with these types of organizations, and what wisdom or advice can you share with people that want to make changes but don't necessarily know how?
That's a huge question. I can talk about how I got involved in activism. The story starts when I was a teenager. I got into environmentalism, and I thought it was super important to save the earth. And I was very oriented on individual actions, we all got to not use plastic forks anymore, things like that. And in CEGEP, I was in the Green Earth Club, and we did kind of individual action oriented stuff as well. Produce less garbage, this and that. The permanent job that I finally got after probably 5, 6, 7 months actually after I graduated from university was in an environmental organization. And I had been specifically looking for that because I felt that the change I wanted to make in the world was in the environmental realm. And I figured if I could be paid to do that, that's great. And I already knew, as I explained earlier, that I wasn't going to be getting a high salary in anything that I did out of school because I knew that I wanted to be working in the community sector. So I got a job in an environmental organization, worked there for 2.5 years. They did a lot of projects that were mostly oriented around individual action, kind of encouraging residents of Montreal to do this and that, to have a smaller footprint, and educating residents about the environment and about sustainable lifestyle and living. We also did other projects, more large scale kind of structural projects, for example, helping the city introduce food waste pickup at the citywide scale. So I was involved in a couple of these different things, but I had this creeping feeling since I was a teenager that none of it was working. I had signed countless petitions. I had gone to this rally and that rally. I had written to my parliament representative. I had seen people who work on environmental causes in the nonprofit sector. I had seen them work extremely hard on projects that wouldn't get off the ground. All of this was very frustrating to me. It was frustrating to see so many people put in hours for environmentalism and to see pretty much no outcome. I mean, no non-negligible outcome. That is, no significant reduction in carbon emissions that would prevent us from heading towards a 1.5 degree increase in CO2 levels in the atmosphere versus pre-industrial levels. So that was a frustration. And even as I worked in the environmental sector myself, it was a frustration because there's obstacle after obstacle, and you get caught in the trap of doing this contract and that contract that's for the money so that you can pay your people like a decent wage, but that has nothing to do with environment, or that is even questionable on like the environmental impact that it has. So I was kind of like, with this frustration in the back of my mind, I eventually learned about Extinction Rebellion, which is the activist organization that I do work with now. I learned about them in the summer of 2019. And I immediately saw it as like this radical, like well-constructed movement that was taking the planet by storm and seemed to have a capacity for real impact in terms of climate change. And so I just started like slipping into them and doing work here and there with them. And like now I'm like a full-blown rebel, as we call them, as we call ourselves, doing this and that for the organization. I think for people who want to get involved in environmentalism and climate change or sustainability, if you have the individual like gusto and energy to like put on a project, go for it. But if you need a little kick in the ass, like join an organization. I think people need to join organizations to find their impact, to find the impact that they're going to make, because as an individual, it's very hard. First of all, you need more than one person to make an impact. And also, it's highly encouraging to be surrounded by a community of people who are just as passionate as you are.
Yeah, so what drew you to XR in particular? Because I know you're saying you've worked with these other organizations and kind of felt like nothing was really happening at a certain point. And I know you mentioned, and I've heard this too, how they're kind of radical, or you're like, we need radical change for anything to happen, right? So was that what kind of drew you to them, or what was the main thing that made you choose to go with XR?
Yeah, I think it's a thing that XR says, is that the nature of our action on climate change needs to match the severity of the issue. So like climate change is like an existential threat that the human race as a whole has like never before faced in history. So we believe that we need to go to the highest level of radical action short of violence, because we're a nonviolent movement. We need to go to that highest level to meet the severity of the issue we're fighting against. So, I mean, what we do is civil disobedience, which is essentially putting yourself in a position where you could get arrested. And the idea is to make your point that way, because it's politically impossible to ignore that kind of thing. And the visibility of it is super, super, super powerful. So I think that's kind of what drew me to XR, was that I had seen a lot of politicians come and go and say a lot of words about the environment. But what XR was proposing was to kind of grab those politicians by the balls, put your body on the line, albeit in a nonviolent and pacifistic way, which totally aligns with my values, and show those politicians who's boss as best you can as a single citizen of the country. And the best way you can do that, history has showed us, is with civil disobedience. So civil disobedience is not something I knew a lot about at all before I joined XR. Obviously, like, I've been steeped in the history of like the Black civil rights movement in the US, Gandhi in India, the Indian independence movement. So these are things that we're all steeped in, you know, as from when we're children. Everyone knows who Gandhi is, who Martin Luther King is, who Malcolm X is, who Rosa Parks is. I mean, it's a tradition that I had and that I knew about in the background, but that I had never considered that I could participate in for a cause of my own. And XR was proposing that.
So leading off of kind of what XR does, and you talk about civil disobedience, there's some degree of discomfort involved with doing something like that. And I think a big part of activism, right, is making people uncomfortable and having them face head on kind of the problems that our society is dealing with. But people often shy away from uncomfortable situations. It seems like discomfort, though, is a very important part of your work and what your activism is. So how do you approach discomfort, and what is your relation to something being, uncomfortable? Is that even maybe a good sign for you, or like what's kind of is there a line between comfort, too much discomfort, or how does that work?
Well, there's one clear line for sure, and that's having to do with violence. That's like a very, very clear line. Like we at Extinction Rebellion, and I myself personally believe that like nonviolence is the way to go, mainly because if you use violence, you're using the language of the state. And if you're trying to fight the state using the language of the state will always win. I feel like as long as we're below that line, and I think verbal violence counts too, hate speech or targeted speech at like non-political individuals, blaming and shaming people, those are forms of verbal violence. I think that there's no threshold of discomfort to like be wary of as long as it remains nonviolent. That's kind of how I feel about it.
Yeah. So in that case, would you even almost harness discomfort and use it to your advantage as like, if I'm feeling uncomfortable, maybe this is actually a good thing, and this is the more uncomfortable without getting to violence, obviously, then maybe almost like the better, like, I don't know.
Yeah, well, we do. That's exactly what XR does. For example, I mean, a great example is that XR Quebec organized, they climbed the bridge, the Jacques Cartier Bridge, in last October. And that represented a huge amount of discomfort in terms of all the drivers whose commute got totally wrecked by the fact that our rebels climbed the bridge at like 7 a.m. in the middle of rush hour, and then the cops proceeded to close the bridge for 3 hours. We got a lot of heat for that. Like we were getting death threats and like angry messages on Facebook and all these things that were testaments to the amount of discomfort that particular action had caused for people. But again, like life goes on for those people. And if they were upset, at least it means it's because they were paying attention. And that's kind of what Extinction Rebellion does, is like we get people's attention. If we can't get those people to go start doing their own research online about climate change, then at least we've put the thought of climate change and the climate emergency in their head. And we've shown them that there are fellow citizens of theirs that are willing to pull off this kind of shit because they really believe in it.
And I feel like our society is almost super sanitized, and the way we approach everything is just to like have it, anything that's uncomfortable we don't really want to deal with or confront. And I think it's really at odds with, everything, all the problems that we're facing in society now, right? Because we're not really willing to face that discomfort and confront these things head on. Like, the climate emergency is not something that should be taken really lightly. And it is kind of terrifying and uncomfortable to be like, okay, this is what's happening. But if we just sit by, it'll just be worse. So.
Yeah, and I think that people's reaction to discomfort is to just retreat towards comfort. I think that climate change is a really uncomfortable thought for people, and that people's immediate reaction is to deny it. I mean, I'm not saying that people are denying climate change, but they deny it really on a deep level, like spiritually in themselves. For people to really sit down and think and put themselves in their own shoes 30 years from now, where their children might live in a world that's not at all at the same level of comfort that they themselves have today. It's like hugely disturbing thought. And I think that it's seeing as it's a worldwide issue, people feel very powerless in the face of it. I think no one should be blamed for having the reaction of ignoring or denying themselves the emotional or spiritual implications of climate change. I think it's a perfectly natural thing to do. It's a defense mechanism. But that's why communities around this thing exist. That's why movements exist. The Extinction Rebellion is not the only ones. Like, there's others. Sunrise Movement in the US, Greenpeace, all these organizations that are doing different things.
It reminds me a bit of the pandemic happening now, where it's a similar issue where everyone's affected by it, and it really takes global efforts and mobilization, governments, to tackle this issue. And it's the thing with COVID is that it's very present and kind of obvious because it's a risk, like immediate risk to your health, right? So it's easy for people to get on board. Like, yes, I agree with social distancing. I agree with whatever I have to do to be safe and keep my family safe. And it's like the climate emergency is the same type of problem, but the problem is that with it though, is that people don't, see the immediate threat or see how it's going to affect their life today, right? So, but it's the exact same type of problem, a global scale. It's like facing everyone's is going to be affected. I mean, whether the richer people can maybe push it off more or whatever, but it's still very much a similar issue. So I wonder what were your thoughts on that? Like, if we were able to mobilize in the same way against climate change as we did against this type of pandemic, you think we could really make some change, right? Like,
immensely. I mean, everyone in North America and Europe since March 2020 has made significant sacrifices in their lives, and by and large been okay with it because they understand the gravity of the issue. Climate change is exactly the same on kind of a structural level as the pandemic. It's just that it's not today, and it's not even 3 months from now. It's like 15 years from now. And I'd even say the same or similar could be said for systemic racism and colonialism globally. Systemic racism is something that is an illness that our society has that hasn't been addressed in any coordinated way with leadership from the government. If these things, if climate change, if the climate crisis and systemic racism were addressed by governments the same way the pandemic has been addressed in the past few months, who knows where we could be? I mean, it would be hard. The pandemic was hard. I mean, quarantine and isolation was hard, but we did it because we saw the value in it.
I wanted to touch on something that you've started recently and that partly kind of inspired this podcast, but I know you started a project looking at people's experiences in the city during the pandemic. And obviously, I think it's still in very early stages, but, and same thing for me with this podcast, like early stages still, but how do you decide on whether something is worth pursuing or not? And when do you know to let something go or to really run with it?
I think in my life, it's something I've learned a little bit. I've had to learn. I think that I've struggled a lot in my life at instances where I feel like I need to make a decision. A decision needs to be made to either invest it all, go all in, or like turn away and look at other opportunities. But my new outlook is kind of just like play around, like experiment with it. There's often, I think in the most cases, there's no way to know before you've started doing it. And that's my kind of new outlook, is that you start doing it, put a few hours in here and there, you kind of test the waters. And if it feels right, continue. I think that's essentially it. Because I think most people have a decent sense of intuition with these things, with things that they do or want to do in their life. I think a lot of people struggle with decision, but we mostly struggle with decision before we've put our toes in the water. You can't really like decide whether to leave your job for another job and like have the opportunity to go like try the other job for like a month before making your decision. So those are really hard decisions to make. But with something like the COVID experience in the city archiving project that I've started, the question of whether it's worth it to pursue it, I think is going to come soon, or it's already coming now. I've done 7 interviews, and they've been really cool. And so I think it's worth pursuing. But after the first, second, third interview, I wasn't really sure yet.
Yeah, it was interesting because I talked to my friend last week too, and they mentioned a similar thing of this idea of having this gut feeling and going with your gut. And I think it's really interesting because it's never something that's really, you can't really learn that, or it's not like an analytical approach to doing something, whereas that's kind of what at least school sometimes teaches you to do, right? Like analyze everything, figure out the perfect course of action. But really what I'm getting the sense is like, you know, there are these other forces at work that you just have to feel it and go with your gut.
Exactly. I think going with your gut, and also another element of the thing is that you can't predict what's going to happen. You can't predict the kinds of challenges or opportunities that might arise before you start a project. So you might start a project being 70% convinced in it, and then something happens, some other new opportunity arises here and there. You realize something about it that like makes you go full 100% enthusiasm. I think that's another element that you can't know beforehand, which is why you've got to start doing it.
So what kind of inspires you to create, or what gets you to the place where, okay, I'm going to do this thing, like I'm going to create this thing, or I'm going to start this project, or what is kind of the motivation or the inspiration behind those types of things?
The mindset that I've learned in life is that I need to be productive, and productivity is something that has pushed me great lengths and also been an oppressive force in my life since university, I'd say, or since Cégep maybe. So I think that a lot of my drive for projects that I do are, well, they start with enthusiasm. They start on a positive note. I think they start with just like curiosity about the world, and enthusiasm and working with people. I just like working with people. And then I think that the second driver that comes after that is often a drive for productivity and a sense of responsibility for things. And these are forces that drive, but they're also forces that can crush my energy in projects. So I'm trying to unlearn the doctrine of productivity in these kinds of projects. And I'm actually starting to teach myself a new doctrine, which is that of experiment. I think that curiosity about things and enthusiasm about doing things in the world has always driven me. But I think that experimentation is another driver, which is very related to curiosity, but it kind of works differently in that it's kind of a perspective that allows you to pursue things without knowing yet if they're worth it. And it allows you to be open to the unknown possibilities in these things, in these projects, what I was just talking about in the previous question. So this is like this new thing that I've kind of discovered and that I'm trying to work with more and more, is the experimentation aspect, because that's where the excitement is. The excitement is trying things and not knowing the outcomes, and then seeing what the outcomes are and being pleasantly surprised, or getting constructive, negative outcomes that are constructive, which are equally as important.
You mentioned you like to work with other people and get other people involved, but how do you get other people to care? How do you decide when to bring other people in, or is it from the start where you try to get people on board? Like, how does that work, working with other people?
This is something that I'm definitely working on. Well, I mean, some projects are personal. So I think with personal projects, I'll start them off my own, and I'm a very slow person. Like, things take a lot of time to gel. So I'll start off these projects slowly, work on them, and then at some point I'll realize that there's some element of the project that I'm not capable of doing or that I need feedback on. And then by that point it's clear what those are, and I can, pinpoint the people that I need to help me with it. For projects that like necessarily involve people at the outset, I don't know. I mean, you just like need to broadcast your idea, I guess. I mean, most of the time, if you have an idea for something you want to do, you have someone in your circle who who would be also into the idea. And then it's just a question of creating enthusiasm in that person, right? Because people are busy, so it's tough. It's tough to get people on board with doing something. But if you like deliver enough enthusiasm to them and also give them time to like digest and reflect on the project, I think that they're into getting on board.
Maybe you could talk a bit about what your most recent thing was. I know you mentioned you quit your job like last week or something, but so how did that come about, and what made you do that, right? Like that's probably a big decision to make, and how did that play out?
That decision was a compromise with myself in the sense that I had this position in this organization and I was very comfortable in that position. I owned it. Everyone else on the team was happy with me being in that position. And I kind of like constructed the position I was in too. Like it was very much mine. That's like a great place to be in, like emotionally at work. You come in to the office at the beginning of the day knowing exactly what you have to do because you're the one who created the projects that you're working on, and your boss trusts you and your colleagues trust you and the people on your team trust you. So like that's probably the one of the most privileged places to be in a job. Also, like I was doing something that's like, pretty gratifying work, working on environment, despite the things I've said about being frustrated about obstacles and slowness. Honestly, I had the feeling that I was a big fish in a small pond at this organization. I think that the drive for experimentation and curiosity had a hand in making me feel like I needed to push myself out of the comfortable position I was in and go look at other things. So it was a compromise in the sense that like I had projects that were like on track and that I could make happen if I continued to stay there, and I would be in a comfortable position and be in a good place emotionally at work. But I just knew I had my gut feeling and I trusted it. I knew that I need to go see elsewhere because I think I had a sense that I had kind of worn out the shoes that I was wearing there, and that I needed some new food for thought, some new food for creativity, some new food for excitement. And I know that the world's big and that there's a lot out there that's going to interest me that I haven't found yet. And I also knew that I'm not the only person who can do this job. And sometimes that's what an organization needs too. Sometimes an organization needs some new blood to bring a new perspective on something, on a project, so that the organization can find opportunities that they wouldn't have found potentially otherwise. So that was a compromise. Also, I mean, like quitting your job during a pandemic, like is not advisable, I think. I'd been working there for 2.5 years. I've saved up a little bit of money so that I can kind of coast for like a couple months while I just take a step back and like absorb what's going on in the world right now, go shopping for other opportunities around. And yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
I don't really know what your work is, but I know that you're heavily involved in it and kind of passionate about it and come at it from that inherent interest in what you work in. With that in mind, how do you balance your work life and your like personal life, having to maybe, give up some sort of thing in your personal life to progress in work or vice versa?
That has happened to me. I'm something of a workaholic, I think. And again, that's something that I'm trying to unlearn as well. And I have had relationships in the past suffer from my workaholic tendencies, especially at the beginning of this job that I had. I was working an immense amount and it was extremely exciting for me. And so I was putting a lot of my mental energy and emotional energy into my new job. And I had a relationship at that point, and it was detrimental to that relationship. And I've had other relationships that have been uncomfortable with the fact with kind of my work-life balance. I've learned a lot though. I've learned a lot about how notions of productivity work. I've learned that if you're making micro decisions about how to be more productive here and there, everywhere throughout your day, they're probably not working and they're probably not worth it. Don't eat while working to save an hour of your time at work. Take your hour off for lunch and like eat your lunch with humans or in the park. You're not going to gain and you're not going to change the world with that extra hour. It's important for your spiritual health to be cognizant of the micro decisions we make about productivity all the time.
I think people are realizing you can almost be more productive by doing less. And what you're saying about, even taking an hour to get your lunch or taking care of your own mental health, and it'll really have benefits to your work. And yeah, maybe you could speak a bit more of how you approach that, or how you think society doesn't really pay attention to that as much, or if you think that's changing already, or if you're optimistic about that. I don't know.
I think I'm not optimistic about where society is or is heading in terms of productivity pressure. But I think that like the question we have to ask when we're talking about productivity is, what is it to be human? What is it to be a person? Before being a person in society, say, yes, most people have passions. If your work is your passion, then lucky you. That's really good news. If your work is your passion, then you're probably susceptible to overworking. But I think that in our culture, we treat passion, if you have one, as the one thing that really matters, which is not the case. But I think even love falls by the wayside, what with the doctrine of productivity. But again, like, what is it to be human or be a person? Say, going for a walk, eating food, cooking food, sharing food with others, listening to your body, knowing when to stop, knowing yourself, listening to yourself. And I think that all these things that are not passion related are equally important, but we lose sight of them just because our culture reinforces passion and work and productivity.
I'm of a similar mindset, and having that kind of mindset, though, it almost seems like we're at odds with the dominant culture and makes it that much harder for us, right? Like, we are still in cultural and societal constructs, so there are parameters. How are you navigating that, especially now that you have left your full-time job?
Everything I just said about being a person is that stuff I learned like in the last, I don't know, 6 months or even less. I feel like this is new knowledge for me. So I'm very much riding this wave of like becoming aware of these facts. I've been jobless for about 2 weeks now. I do have moments of anxiety where I'm like, oh man, like I haven't done anything today. It's such an unproductive day. And then I have to train myself. Like, what is an unproductive day? What is a day? You're being a person. That's kind of what counts here. As long as you feel good at the end of the day, it's like you've had a good day. And even if you're feeling bad, sometimes it's because you've learned. So right now I'm feeling okay about it. And I'm actually feeling excited because I'm learning how to deal with my productive impulses. And also to be frank, I'm still being productive. I have like different projects going on. So I think I still am giving myself the candy that I seek.
I think we have different associations of like what productivity it is and how important it is. But like what you're saying, it's at the end of the day, right? We're humans, and I think even just existing is almost enough, right? Like you need to have like unconditional love for yourself, even if you haven't written a 10-page essay today or like whatever, right? But it's very hard, like you said, to it's almost unlearning these things. And I think especially in this time, though, it's given at least me the opportunity to really face these things head on and face myself as a human, right? And
I feel the same way. The implications of the pandemic in terms of staying at home has allowed me to gain perspective on this, because I've always been someone who's like running around to this and that, like only come home to sleep. But being forced to stay at home has actually helped me on this learning process.
My last question was just about the future. And I know you're heavily involved with fighting the global climate crisis and being involved with different activist organizations, like I mentioned before. But are you optimistic about the future? And if so, how do you stay optimistic, and how do you stay motivated to feeling like you're going to make a change, right?
I don't think I'm optimistic about the future of society, but what keeps me motivated is that I know that there's always going to be good people, and I'm always going to be able to surround myself with good people. Like, that's my solace. I know that some of those good people are going to be the ones that like I'm fighting the fight with. And just the fact that those are such great people gives me a little flame of optimism for the future.
So for you, it's not even a question of like optimism or not, or hope, or because a lot of people would be like, you have to be optimistic about the future, right? If you're fighting these problems, or else why would you be engaging in trying to solve them in the first place, right? So, but you're almost saying something different, right?
I'm ambitious about the future. I'm ambitious for the future that I want to see. I guess some people need optimism to like help themselves get out of bed in the morning. I just know that it's going to be a good day if I get to spend time with like my people. And then in terms of like the passions that I'm fighting for, the fights that I'm fighting, like those are things that I have ambition for.
So what does get you out of bed in the morning? What does motivate you to face the day if it's not optimism, right?
I think what I've been saying actually about curiosity and enthusiasm, curiosity about the day. I think productivity gets me out of bed too. Like this notion of like, I got shit to do, which is good. If it gets me out of bed, that's great. I mean, productivity, for what it's worth, it has a lot of motivating factors. But I think productivity, curiosity, knowing that there's people to see, people to talk to.
What's next for you? Do you know? Are you even planning your future, or do you just take things as they come?
I've just got like a bunch of notions in my mind of things that I'm not fully pursuing. Like I'm not spending hours a day looking into to try and create my future, but I have a couple notions in my mind that are kind of acting like magnets, say, or like magnetic poles that are kind of orienting me this way and that so that I have these in my field of vision. One thing is my dad bought a rural property in New York State and he's renovating it. And I'd love to just go down there for a month or two and do carpentry.
Learn a new skill and
do physical things, interact with material, learn a new skill, hang out with my dad.
Again, these things like wouldn't traditionally be seen as something that people would be doing in our society, right? Like there's almost like they're not valued, but I love the idea of what you said about just being human, right? Like we're just humans, and like if you can do this experience and learn something about yourself or learn something about the world around you, I think it is meaningful and worth pursuing. And so that's kind of what I like about your outlook too. There's not this external validation or external societal forces pressuring you to do a certain thing and having to feel like you're doing that. So it's kind of inspiring to see that from you.
Work in progress, man.
Where can people find you? Do you have any sort of thing you want to promote or a website or?
Oh man. I mean, if people want to find me, hit me up on Facebook, Gabriel TD, TND for my last name.
To follow XR, what's that?
People should go hit up Extinction Rebellion Quebec, XRQC, on our website, on Facebook, on Instagram, on Twitter, and just check out other Extinction Rebellion chapters. There's 700 in the world, so there's one around the corner from your house probably.
Awesome. Thank you, Gabe, for coming on.
Thank you, Toby. This is great.